Hey everyone, this is Casino Crime here, and I'm the founder and lead instructor for PLOQuickPro.com. Before we get into the content here, I want to take a moment to not only thank you for subscribing to Bluff, but also for checking out this short video. Now, the content I'm sharing with you today is a short segment taken from my flagship program called PLO Quick Pro Elite. The program consists of 14 lessons and more than 12 hours of footage, and is the best way to learn how to play profitable PLO. If you like this video, then you'll definitely get a lot out of the other free content we have on the site. So after you finish watching, be sure to head over to PLOQuickPro.com and tell me what you think of our videos, articles, and interviews with pros like Ben Lamb. Thanks again for checking out the video, and I look forward to helping you improve your PLO game. Here's another hand that I played about a year ago where I really screwed up, and I want to show it to you for basically two reasons. The first is to give you an example of what not to do on a dynamic turn. And the second reason is to explain to you how I screwed up, as well as the correct thought process to use whenever you're faced with a decision between check raising and barreling on a dynamic turn texture. Everything pre-flop is very standard. We min open under the gun with Queen Queen Jack 5 double suited and get called by two players that have position on us. Three-way to the flop, we decide to c-bet 80% pot on an 8-3-4 two-tone board with an overpair, backdoor straight draw, and the third nut flush draw, and get called by the player in the cutoff. Now, my reads on the opponent are very important for this hand. He's a pretty significant loser in the game, but he can definitely be tricky to play against if you're not paying attention. The best description I can give is that he's an aggressive bad fish. Like most of the other hands we've looked at, the turn is where the interesting decision point in the hand is made. The dealer rips off a 9 of diamonds, giving us a gut shot to go along with our overpair and flush draw. Now, before we go any further, let's go down the checklist we've used in the previous hands to determine what our best option is. Let's take a look at what the SPR is first. There's $368 behind and $78 in the pot, leaving the SPR at roughly 4.7, which according to what we learned in the slides, means that if we choose to continue our aggression, it's probably better to lean towards check raising instead of barreling based solely on what the SPR is. Next, remember that the profitability of a check raise primarily depends on two things. Number one is the amount of equity you have against his stack off range, and number two is his folding frequency. In regards to our equity against his stack off range, I think we definitely have enough to play for stacks. Here's a simulation I ran on Pro Poker Tools that displays what our equity is against what I perceive to be his stack off range. I'm sure this isn't 100% accurate, but it's definitely close enough to get the point across. Basically, the hands I made sure to include were made hands better than ours, like sets and two pairs, draws better than ours, like wraps and flush draws, combo draws that include a better flush draw, and then made hands and draws that were worse than ours. Okay, so we know that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 38% equity against the stack off range. But perhaps the more important factor to consider is how much fold equity we have. Recall from the slides that there's significantly less fold equity on dynamic boards than on static boards, which means that we should expect to get bet called a lot more in these types of situations. And given that draw domination is more of an issue on dynamic boards than on static boards, it's very important to take the line that keeps his range the widest if you're going to be playing for stacks. Simply put, if we know we're going to be playing for stacks, then it makes a lot of sense to take a line that's most likely to get the money in against as weak of a range as possible. Moreover, if two ranges contain the same amount of hands that are willing to play for stacks, but one of them has more air and weak made hands in it, then we would obviously always prefer to be up against the latter range as much as possible. For example, in this case, it's easy to see the difference in the strength of our opponent's raising range facing our second barrel and his betting range when check 2 if you compare them side by side. What's important here, or what I want you to internalize the most, is how check raising in spots like these keeps his range wider than barreling. The key in spots where you have 38% equity against an opponent's range like we do here is to figure out how to give yourself the best chance to realize that equity. For example, an aggressive bad opponent can easily interpret our check as weakness and take a stab with almost 100% of the hands that peel the flop, namely weak and medium strength draws, such as naked flush draws, weak and medium strength made hands, like pair plus sidecard type hands. But if we bomb the turn and get raised, it's very unlikely that he's going to make an aggressive move like that without a stronger made hand or draw than ours. That reminds me of something else. I want you to listen closely for a second to what I'm about to say. One of the best pieces of advice about hand reading that I ever received was from a buddy of mine that won an event at the Win Classic last year, and I want to pass it along to you now. He said that when you have the initiative, anytime you're taking what's perceived to be a strong line and someone is raising you, then you should probably kick your hand into the muck unless you have the goods. It sounds simple, but I think it's very applicable at the tables. A lot of players, myself included, unnecessarily make hand reading tougher by out-leveling themselves into thinking their opponents are a lot more in tune with their play than they really are. Personally, I found that most players play their cards more straightforwardly than you think. Your ego wants you to believe that you're conquering a table full of very tough and thinking opponents, when in reality, most of them are taking standard lines consistent with the value of their hand. Anyhow, back to the hand. Instead of doing the right thing and check raising, we decide to bet slightly over 3/4 pot, and he insta-raises us the size of the pot. Now, before we move on to the next hand, let's do a quick analysis of what the possible outcomes are on the river when we fire a second barrel instead of check raise. First, one positive outcome of barreling is that he folds, which he will certainly do at least some percentage of the time. But in this case, I think he's folding a very low percentage of the time. The 9 of diamonds blends well with the type of range that peels the flop. It completes a number of 2-pair combinations for several pair and sidecard hands, and also adds more straight draws to the board. On the other hand, if the turn was an ace or a king, then I might consider barreling because our fold equity is a lot higher on those cards than the middling cards. Also, the hand becomes very tricky on the rivers we don't improve on, especially given that the SPR will be a very awkward 1.3 if he calls our turn bet. Additionally, think about how perfectly his turn calling range can play against us on the river. On the rivers that we turn our hand into a bluff on, he can call us down if he thinks we're bluffing. If we check and he improves, he can confidently value bet the winner. If we bet and he has the stones, he can ship on us and perhaps get a crying call. If his draw misses, he could still make us fold by representing another draw that filled on the river. For example, if he has nut clubs, he can easily represent a backdoored straight on the river. Ah, the luxury of having position on later streets, right before our very eyes. Additionally, for the times he decides to raise our turn bet instead of smooth call, we're in a terrible spot because of the reverse implied odds going into the river. So given that flatting his turn raise is out of the question, our only choice is to fold or go all in over the top of his raise, which also puts a cramp in our style because doing so reduces our effective pot odds. So let's do a quick recap of why check raising in this spot beats the shit out of double barreling. Is the SPR greater than 4? Check. Will we be left with an uncertain hand value on the river if we bet and get called? Check. Are we facing an opponent that's likely to bet a weak, wide range when checked to? Check. Do we have enough pot equity and fold equity to make our check raise profitable? Checkmate. Now, before we move on to the next hand, just in case you needed a reminder for why check raising is the better option in spots like this, I want you to once again pull out your PLO quick stats sheet and revisit the all-in semi-bluff table towards the end of it. If you look closely, you'll see that anytime you have 40% equity in a hand, your opponent practically never has to fold for an all-in semi-bluff to be profitable, regardless of what size of the pot you bet.